Hello, I'm astrologer Patrick Arundell, and thanks for joining me for my latest of my celestial insights to the royal family. Today I'm in the rather noble setting of Shrewsbury Castle in Shropshire, an ancient setting indeed. So what I want to talk to you today is, why did Prince Harry and Meghan Markle come together in matrimony in the way they did? Well, I would like to tell you that I do feel that this relationship is based on genuine attraction and quite a lot of personal simpatico in terms of their values. Now, obviously, there has been a big change in the situation recently, and the couple have decided to settle in America. They've really asserted their boundaries. The royal family have pushed back and asserted theirs, and there does seem to be somewhat of a fracture in the relationship. So what do their natal horoscopes tell us about that change? Well, Meghan Markle may be a Leo. She may have Mercury alongside her sun, pretty close, and also the North Node, all in the first house. Now, there are 12 houses in Western natal astrology, and those are almost like the activity centres. And the first house is very much about being individual. So she has the magnificence, the charisma of that energy in the sign of Leo, the communicational skills of Mercury being in this sign. But also in the first house, this gives her an innate desire to be an individual spirit and have her voice heard. So much more difficult for her to flex into some kind of preordained structure. And in fact, when she got into the situation and they first met, I did predict that within 2 years she would be thoroughly bored being in such a kind of rigid circumstance. But her ascendant is actually quite complex, it's quite nuanced, it's in the rather feeling sign of Cancer. So her compassion for those who are less fortunate, her work that she's done around equalities, which predates her entering the royal family, I do think that's very genuinely held. But on the other end of the heavens, moving in the sky, is tiny Pluto, which is very much to do with transformation, but it is also to do with power. And Meghan Markle's natal Pluto actually squares her ascendant. So I do feel, and it's in her fourth house, so very much to do with power complications around very personal or close relationships. That is in her chart. That is not because of the royal family. And then at the end of her seventh house, which is how she interacts with others, there is moving in the sky tiny Pluto. So that's squaring up with her natal Pluto, a very difficult, intense transit that goes on for all of us at some point in our life. But it's in now, the moving Pluto in the sky is really in the part of her situation to do with the way she interacts with others. And Pluto can deconstruct, it can destruct. So that is what's happened with the wider relationship, it would seem, from what we're reading, has gone on. But the ironic thing is that Harry's midpoint between the sun and the moon, which is like the balance of his more masculine and more receptive energies, is actually conjunct Meghan Markle's ascendant. So you can see why that would be such a glorious connection. But it means at the other end of the spectrum, the move in Pluto in the sky is also having a massive impact on his personal relationships. So I don't think this is something that's coming from one or the other, it's coming from both of them. And one of the big complications for Harry is that when he was born, Saturn, the planet of limitation, was in his ninth house, which is to do with freedom. But also it's right at the top of the ninth house, edging towards the 10th house cusp, which is very much to do with our responsibilities and obligations. And I think that he was struggling in that role for some years before Meghan Markle made an appearance in his life. And the responsibility of that role has really been quite hard for him to bear. But also both of them, in their sixth house of their horoscopes, have no planets or influences at all, no asteroids. And that's really fascinating, because the sixth house is where we show due diligence, we're sacrificing, we do what we should do, we put ourselves into a situation where we don't necessarily get an instant reward at a personal level. Now that's not to say they're not sacrificing in their own unique ways, because they obviously want to help people. But I think the rigidity of the Buckingham Palace machine just didn't work for either of them. Just opening garden fates was never going to be stimulating or big enough for them. So I think that's quite fascinating that they do have an absence of sixth house energy in their horoscope. But in terms of neat attraction, Meghan Markle has many of her inner planets in Harry's 7th house. That's very auspicious for a relationship. Now, a lot of her planets fall in his 8th house, which is very deep. He's got the sun in the 8th house. This is very Scorpionic. He feels things very deeply, and so does she. So I feel that this is a very, very deep connection, and it's a business relationship as much as a personal one. However, it is true that Meghan Markle's Mars is right on Harry's descendant or 7th house cusp, and that can be quite difficult in relationships in the longer term. It creates a tremendous amount of physical attraction in the early days, but then it becomes much more challenging because Mars is very outspoken, and I think Meghan Markle's not going to stop being outspoken, and that could become a little bit more tricky for Harry to deal with in the years to come. Now, Meghan Markle, I mentioned before, does have that Pluto influence squaring her ascendant, which is the potential really for lots of power battles in her life. But she also has Mars in her natal chart in the 12th house, and that's a very tender place, particularly in the sign of Cancer. It can be very defensive, and it can be quite suspicious, and it squares up with her Saturn and the Moon, which are conjunct in her 3rd house of thoughts, which makes her way of speaking probably quite precise, quite clipped, quite to the point. Moon conjunct Saturn is quite cool in terms of emotion. I can only be honest about that. And then you move Mars to square them as well. It means when she says something, her subconscious can often see her say something quite quickly and speedily, perhaps not always given herself the opportunity to think it through. And maybe that was the influence that the courtiers found quite difficult. She is a to the point character. She may not have felt that she was being unkind, but actually that's how they may have perceived it. But I do feel that it gives her a potentially suspicious nature. I can only be honest about that, and a quite reactive type of nature. But there's no doubt about it in terms of personal charisma and connection that I think it's a very genuine relationship. But I feel that Uranus, the planet of freedom, does interact between their charts in quite a challenging way. And even though his Venus is on her Pluto, which is one of great sexual attraction, and even though her Pluto is on his Venus, which is one of great attraction, I do feel that that Uranus influence over time could bring a much more restless and perhaps frenetic vibration to bear. And we will see how it pans out for them. But at this stage, you can definitely see why they've been drawn together. So thank you so much for joining me for this celestial segment on the royal family, and please stay tuned for more. Thank you and goodbye.